Hey class. So today what we are going to look at is specifically assignment 2 from today's ALST exam. I know you guys are probably exhausted. This is the second practice exam that you've taken, and this is also probably the 50th response that you've written. And so I do recommend that you continue practicing if you're taking the exam anytime between now and January. However, I completely understand if you want to take a couple of days vacation from response writing and then get back into it after you've sort of uh, cleared your head. That being said, oops, we're going to look at assignment 2. So it's important that we first reread, and reread again what assignment 2 is actually asking us to do. So you'll notice immediately my eyes are drawn to the fact that I have to use passage B. So in my head, I'm thinking, oh, was that a passage that I really enjoyed? Or was that a passage that was especially tough? For me, that was one that I didn't necessarily find myself agreeing with. However, it wasn't a tough read. So just assessing for my own sake. Maybe some of you felt the same way. So you'll remember passage B was about David Rugliano talking about his experience in Connecticut, owning a business, and the negative impact the increase in minimum wage would have on his businesses, right? So I'm taking passage B, and I have to use either or both of the graphics. So for me, that might be really exciting news because maybe one graph was more confusing than the other. Maybe there was one specific graph that I made total sense of while the other graph I wasn't so sure about. If that's the case, they're letting you off the hook because they're saying you can pick one. If you felt like you kind of understood both graphs but not enough to make an entire paragraph, then that's also a good thing because you get to combine uh, both of the graphics and talk about both of them. So already we know passage B, one or both of the graphics. Then we see 100 to 200 words, and we have to explain how the information in the table and or chart can be integrated with the author's central argument against the Fair Minimum Wage Act in passage B. Your response must explain how specific information presented in the graphics either supports or counters the author's claims, reasoning, and evidence. And I red marked this because there was an error here. And include examples from the passage and the graphics to support your explanation. So again, like we have been doing for the entire semester, this is a integrating data into another writing kind of assignment. And so I just want us to remember when we talked about, where is it? When we talked about data, we talked about the 3 steps that you need to go through before you can start talking about the information. We talked about it. Ooh, nope, that's too big. So when you get a graph, a chart, a table, any sort of visual representation, we reminded ourselves or familiarize ourselves. The first step is we need to identify what's going on, right? What is the information that I'm seeing in front of me? What are some keys that I can use to assist me? Is there an x-axis? Is there a y-axis? Is there a title? What sort of keys can I use to really figure out what's going on? So I am choosing to look at this particular table. And so for me, I immediately look at the title, Estimated Effects on Employment, Income, Poverty of an Increase in the Federal Minimum Wage, second half of 2016. So immediately things are popping up at me. Estimated means this is not definite, right? Second half of 2016, this is in the future, again, not definite. I'm noticing that this is $10.10. This is the exact minimum wage increase that we have been talking about in both articles, right? And then I noticed that there are different sort of row titles. Change in employment, and then it says central estimate and likely range. So what I'm getting from here is how many, and I use the key words here. How many more or less workers will be around because of this increase in minimum wage? Number of workers with hourly wages less than the proposed minimum whose earnings would increase in an average week. All that to say, those who are not making 1010, who are making less than 1010, how many of those people would have an increase in their hourly, wait, no, how many of them would see an increase in their paycheck for a week? 16.5 million. So that's a significant number, right? If we're just trying to get a feel for the numbers, 16.5 million people would be impacted by this increase in a positive way, you might say, because their paycheck is bigger. Change in real income. Families whose income is below the poverty threshold, you can even think of threshold as line. So these families live below the poverty line, and they will see a $5 billion increase in their income. Now, not $5 million to one person, but all of these families in total will see a $5 billion increase in their income. That's significant, right? Families whose income is between 1 and 3 times the poverty threshold. So these people are not living below the poverty line. They're living sort of above the poverty line, 1 to 3 times above the poverty line, right? These people will see a $12 billion increase. Now, pay attention to the way spacing works in tables. You see how these are all sort of on the left-hand side, and these families phrases are tabbed in. That means that this change in real income is talking about all 4 of these tabbed in. Change in employment is referring to central estimate and likely range. Number of workers, that's its own little row. So you want to pay attention to spacing. That can be tricky, but again, once you get in the habit of reading graphs and reading tables, this will be a piece of cake. So $12 billion increase to those folks. Families whose income is between 3 and 6 times the poverty threshold, they see a $2 billion increase. Families whose income is 6 times the poverty threshold or more, they see a $17 billion decrease. Now, just a couple of things to note. It seems as though the people that are living 1 to 3 times above the poverty threshold see the most increase, and I would think it's a safe bet to assume that that would be so sort of lower middle class. So it seems as though the people who are being impacted in the most beneficial way are lower middle class to middle class. Then you have upper middle class being impacted, not as significantly, but in a positive way, and below the poverty line. So, below the poverty line, would have more of an impact than upper middle class. However, still not as much as lower middle class. So we're just sort of talking through all what the numbers are saying. And then high middle class, not high middle class, there's no such thing. I don't want to say high class because I feel like that sounds sort of elitist. Super, super rich people will see a $17 billion decrease. Again, these are all just me sort of using what I'm seeing here to make a guess. It's quite possible that, 6 times the poverty threshold is not super, super rich. It could be maybe just super rich. But I'm starting to see a pattern. I'm starting to see that the families who are not impacted in the most beneficial of ways are those who are already making quite a bit of money, right? Or who are already getting quite a bit of income. And then it says change in the number of people below the poverty threshold. So these people who now have gotten $10.10 in minimum wage, the number of people now that will live below the poverty threshold will decrease by 900,000. Hopefully that made sense. And so I don't know how much time that took, but uh, reading through this graph, identifying all the different things going on, took quite a bit of time. But it's a crucial step because you could possibly miss out on a way to integrate what's going on here into one of the passages. So, oh, and I just realized, oh, look at that. So that's not really important. But again, and yes, there you go. We're looking at this graph. Now, why am I looking at this graph? Because personally, I found this to be full of data that I could immediately connect with passage B. The distribution of workers by age, one, I had a hard time really figuring out sort of how I could use this information. I mean, you can use this information because passage B talks about the need of 20 to 24-year-olds and 16 to 19-year-olds having these learning jobs, jobs that they're getting paid really low wages, but it's so that they can learn. And if we don't have the same minimum wage, then all those jobs will disappear, which will be harmful for this specific age group. And so this graph sort of shows that, there are a significant amount of 16-year-olds that are working at minimum wage, and the amount of minimum wage workers decreases as the age increases. So again, it can be connected. I just personally found myself really liking what I was seeing in this first chart. So that's also another real conversation you have to have with yourself. What do I feel comfortable with? What do I think I can make a lot of connections with? And you go from there. So I've decided I'm going to use this graph. All right. And I'm remembering as I'm taking the test all of the different things we talked about, using data. So the first thing I did was I identified, then I have to contextualize. Now, contextualizing means different things, but for the ALST exam, it means how is what I just read on this graph relevant to the passage that I have to talk about? How is it relevant to anything in the passage at all? And so what I've done here, hopefully, great, is I've sort of already listed it. I'm having a hard time figuring out full screen. Okay, well that's full enough. So these are the things that we already noted when I went through the identification process. And then I also wanted to note, right, what is passage B's argument? And specifically, what are some claims that passage B uses to support his argument? And so one argument that I noted when I was annotating, mandating wage increases will only hurt those employees which this proposal seeks to help. So he's saying we shouldn't increase the minimum wage, and it's because it will end up hurting the employees who these wage increases are supposed to help, right? And then I just noted he talked about the Affordable Care Act. And then another claim he makes is that we can't have an increase in minimum wage because it will be followed by a reduction in the number of jobs, particularly entry-level jobs. So those are two claims that he makes to support his argument. Why do I need to note this for myself? Because what the question is asking for is for you to integrate the information from the chart into the author's central argument, and you have to identify how what you see in the graphic supports or counters the author's claim. And so that's why it becomes important. As I'm looking at the graph, is there anything that I saw that could support this claim about hurting employees, or help hurt or support this claim about hurting employees, or hurt or support this claim about losing entry-level jobs or any jobs, right? And so that's when I go through the contextualizing process and I say passage B argues we should not pass the Fair Minimum Wage Act because it will hurt employees in the long run. The graph does not support this claim. Boom, I've contextualized, right? What does this graph say about what I'm reading? It says the exact opposite. And just so you see that, you you can really use this evidence to go whichever way you want to go. Meaning, you can say the graph is helping passage B, you can say the graph is not helping. There's really no wrong or right answer if you're manipulating the evidence in the correct way. So the second one that I have here, passage B argues we should not pass the Fair Minimum Wage Act because it will cause a decrease in jobs. The graph does support this claim. So again, I took those two claims that I wrote before when I was annotating, and I just sort of used them to contextualize how the graph is responding. And then the next part, the last part, probably the hardest part, becomes the analysis. That's where you're saying, okay, so explain to me what happens if the graph supports passage B's claim. Explain to me what happens if the graph does not support passage B's claim. And so what I have here are examples of both. Passage B argues we should not pass the Fair Minimum Wage Act because it will hurt employees in the long run. Notice, these are sentences that I already created above. So I'm sort of scaffolding my way to finish the response. The graph does not support this claim. The graph shows a significant increase in income for families living below the poverty line and above the poverty line. In fact, the only class group, I think class, let's say the only group of people that will be negatively impacted by the increase in minimum wage are those who make 6 times the poverty threshold. Passage B argues that all employees will be impacted negatively. However, the graph indicates that's awkward. The graph indicates those who are already making a lot of money are really the ones that will be impacted. Because passage B relies so heavily on getting sympathy for his circumstance to convince us of his argument, when we realize he is wealthy, there is less willingness to believe him. Okay, so what exactly did I do here? I laid out what the claim is that passage B makes. I also laid out what his argument is, right? His central argument is that we should not pass the Fair Minimum Wage Act. I indicate what the graph says to dispute this claim, and I go further into talking about what's going on in the graph, and then I indicate how this impacts passage B's overall argument. What I'm saying is, if we find out that those who are impacted by this increase in minimum wage negatively are those who are making a lot of money, much of his argument falls because what he's doing, according to me, right, what he's doing throughout the essay is trying to get your sympathy. He's talking about, and this might have been something I talked about in the first response where I'm saying who has the more compelling argument. I might have said that passage B does not have the more compelling argument because he relies too much on emotional appeal. He wants us to feel bad for him because he has to pay Affordable Care Act, he has to pay paid sick leave, and now he has to possibly pay his employees a higher minimum wage. And so when you're relying on sympathy, if we find out that your circumstance does not resemble the circumstance that the reader has, then that sympathy is likely to not happen. Does that make sense? I mean, obviously you can't answer me, but hopefully that makes sense. And so that's really what I've done here. And you might be saying, oh, that doesn't seem like it's enough words. It's 137 words, and so it would fulfill the requirements. And what you would do is you would go back and make sure that you've done all of the different things that the prompt requires. And then let's go to the second example. Can I make it? Okay. Passage B argues we should not pass the Fair Minimum Wage Act because it will cause a decrease in jobs. The graph does support this claim. The graph shows a decrease in 500,000 workers if the minimum wage is increased. A large part of passage B's argument relies on the scary and hypothetical scenario of employers being forced to let their employees go because they cannot afford to pay their wages and their health care. This graph notes that in fact that will be a reality. Although the graph notes the decrease in workers as slight, it is possible that the combination of the wage increase and legislation that Passage B alludes to, Affordable Care Act, paid sick leave, can make this slight decrease a significant decrease. Same exact method, it's just that I've now helped Passage B support his argument, right? And so again, I've laid out what the argument is. I've laid out a claim that supports his argument. I've indicated if the graph helps or not. And then I show how the graph, if it helps, how it helps. And then I indicate how this additional information helps Passage B's overall argument. Hopefully you found this useful. I do know that this is probably the toughest response because it requires, yeah, that's why I have to end soon. It requires a lot of data interpretation. So I completely understand that. And for that reason, what I recommend you do, especially if you're taking the exam anytime soon, is I recommend you pick up a New York Times, any sort of newspaper, and go to any article that you see has charts or data or tables, and sort of force yourself to read through that kind of information once a day. It's a type of reading that's really important, and therefore it's a type of reading that you need to get into the habit of doing every single day. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to comment within this forum, or you can email me and I'd be happy to answer you.